I wanted to introduce my three friends here and also ask that you maybe just for a little bit, maybe empathize with what's going on in the rest of the world. One thing that we do here in the United States is we try to control our monetary policy to help people in the United States. And one of the things our government has done is raise interest rates, obviously, to try and fight inflation. But that has had a very negative effect on a lot of countries around the world that have a lot of dollar denominated debt and who are now experiencing really incredible rises in the cost of basic goods, whether it be gasoline, rice, just meat, any kind of basic things that people need. Oftentimes we make decisions here and we don't really think about what happens elsewhere. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing such an explosion in Bitcoin adoption around the world is that people are opting out into a different system. A lot of times you'll see countries try to impose capital controls. They're trying to prop up a weak currency. They will come and try and actually take your gold. They'll try and take your US dollars. They'll try to make US dollars illegal. They'll try to force you to use a very weak currency. Or they'll try to force you to use somebody else's currency. And for the first time in history, people are able to use mobile phones and internet to access an asset that cannot be devalued or confiscated if it's used properly. It gives them real property rights and it gives them free speech. It allows them to transact and it gives them access to open capital markets. So we've never had this before. So it's novel. We're all learning. We're watching this unfold. It's very humbling. But I'm very grateful for the Bitcoin innovation because it's allowed people to have a way out in a way they've never had before. So that's something I'm thinking about. By way of introduction, again, my name is Alex. I work at the Human Rights Foundation. We are a nonprofit based in New York that was founded by former political prisoners worldwide. We focus on challenging authoritarianism. By our count, that's about 4.3 billion people in about 95 countries around the world who don't have the same kind of checks and balances against their government power that we do here. So all of our programs are designed to help people who live under authoritarian countries. My friends here all come from places that we consider to be authoritarian, and they're going to tell you more about that. And in our work, we started to notice how money was such an important topic, such an important part of the human rights conversation, but it was something that people didn't want to necessarily bring up. Like it was kind of hidden beneath the surface. For example, it's really difficult to send money to uh, the three countries that are represented here. Even just basic administrative stuff like sending a grant can be really challenging. So even just the basics of sending money, receiving money, storing money is really, really hard for most human rights defenders in the world today. This makes their life like miserable, and they have to spend a huge amount of time worrying about even just receiving a grant, storing the money, trying to keep it away from the government so they don't know. Most of these dictatorships have passed various laws about, you're a traitor basically if you receive a gift from abroad, things like that. So, what we started to notice is that governments increasingly, especially as money has digitized, they really go after people in this way. One of the first things a dictatorship will do to a civil society organization is try to shut down their bank account. You see this everywhere from Hong Kong to Nigeria to Belarus. So again, it's not just the fact that people are kind of stuck in weak fiat currencies that are collapsing, or that they don't have the same kind of privileges we do in terms of having Venmo and PayPal and having an ease of use. It's also that like activists are actually being targeted financially, and Bitcoin allows people to escape that and keep their work going. So with that, I wanted to open it up. We're going to hear a little bit from Roya Mahboob, from Meron Estefanos, and from Fadi Elsalameen. We're going to hear a little bit about who they are, what the work they do. We're going to hear a little bit about how they use Bitcoin, and we're going to hear their perspective on why they think Bitcoin is good for the United States and good for American foreign policy. So with that, we'll start with Roya. Welcome, Roya. Thank you for being here.
Thank
Do
you.
you want to? And this is a good moment for me, very special, because Roya's basically the person who taught me about Bitcoin. So I'm very grateful for that. She was the crazy person who started using it in 2013 when it wasn't worth anything at all and was very sketchy. But she figured out how to use it because she had to. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, what you're doing? And I'm sure the audience would love to hear.
Sure. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here today. I'm Roya Mahboob. I'm from Afghanistan, and my story started from 2003 when there is an Indian cafe was open up in Herat, and I heard about this magic box that people connect you with the world, and I was just excited about that, and that's how I get connected, and I decided to make technology be the center of my career. I went to university, I graduated thanks to the Americans that they provided us a great opportunity at the time. And I started my company, and then later on, I started my nonprofit organization because I believe that there are millions of the girls who are like me. They are curious but giving a narrow vision to explore the world. And I just wanted to give them the same tools that has changed my life, my personal life, and my professional life. And that's why we built Digital Citizen Fund to give the access to technology and an opportunity for the young women in developing countries like Afghanistan. We build IT centers inside of the public schools, and we teach young girls at the age of 12 to 18 to learn about basic things, to learn about computer, to level of that they can learn about robotics, they learn about blockchain, they learn about the financial literacy. We help 17,000 of the girls to come to our program. We help hundreds of them to start their own startups. And I don't know how much you heard about Afghan Girls Robotic Team. That's also another project that is involved from our program.
Yeah. So just to recap from my perspective, Roya was named by Time Magazine as one of the most 100 influential people in the world. Who wrote your little bio for you?
Share it to them, right?
Sheryl Sandberg. Yep, that's pretty nice. It was an honor for her to do it, I'm sure. Um, and yeah, I mean, what we observed when we first met Roya was that she was one of Afghanistan's first female technology CEOs and ran an all female tech company doing software services. I think what most people maybe miss about the Bitcoin thing is just how it really is a tool for helping people who are disenfranchised, right, or vulnerable, right? So you were trying to pay the women who worked for you, and the existing system was hard, right? Because you were telling me that when you tried to pay them in cash, like the male relatives would take the money away. They weren't really allowed to open bank accounts, but they had phones, right? Like Facebook was happening; it was a thing back then. So people had phones, so you could pay them in Bitcoin. So you said, "Why not?" Right? And it's really interesting because when she started paying the employees in Bitcoin, Bitcoin was worth $100, and by the end of the year, Bitcoin was worth $1,000. So she thought, of course, that this was like the greatest thing ever. Little did she know Bitcoin would crash back down to $200. So she got like the full roller coaster experience. Now, most people would obviously quit at that point. They would say the thing has failed. I'm going to move on. But you didn't, and you stuck with it. And your sister didn't quit either. And your sister had this little side business, right, where when women wanted to buy something, your sister would buy the Bitcoin from them, right? What's amazing, I think, about your sister's story also is that she ended up saving that Bitcoin and financing her college education with it several years later, which is really cool. She ended up going to Cornell. Um, so why did you not quit when you saw the Bitcoin price crash and it kind of ruined your company in some ways? Why did you not quit? Like what kept you interested in it?
So I will a little bit explain that how we get involved with Bitcoin. We build in a platform that allow women to write the blogs, and they get paid based off on their social impact of their creative ideas. But this and this work that we done it in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we had increased the number of our users and employees that they writing these blogs. But the issue was that many of these women didn't have a bank account, because in our society, it's not only because they are poor or they don't have money or they don't have an ID or the bank has a lot of like restriction, but also because the families and the men's don't want that the women have a bank account because they wanted to control the finance of the women. And so that was an issue. We have to pay these women by cash. And many of the time when you have to take the monies from the bank, if people knows that you have a lot of cash with you, there is a thief, there is a kidnapping happening, and that was always not safe to have a lot of cash, especially in Afghanistan at the time. And then if you send the monies to the like a rural area or to outside of like a Herat, you send to Kandahar, you send to other places. There is middleman that they take some part of the money, and the women's there is no transparency if the women receive the money. There is always the cost, always get increased, and then we tried to use the mobile money, but mobile money didn't work in Afghanistan at the time. It was very successful project in Kenya and other countries, but it wasn't really operated very well in Afghanistan. And then we took thinking about PayPal, but PayPal was banned in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So then we heard about Bitcoin, and obviously that I feel that this is something that is magic. It's like the magic box that I heard it in 2003, and then now in 2013 we heard about Bitcoin, and then we decided, okay, why not we don't use Bitcoin, and that's how we implemented and developed a platform that we paying people's in Bitcoin. Bitcoin actually bypass our physical and social barriers to paying the women. And I feel that Bitcoin is a safeguard of human rights and promotes the freedom.
One of the women that you worked with had to escape, right, for political reasons, and she was able to keep her Bitcoin with her. It's pretty trivial to store your Bitcoin with a seed phrase, which is 12 or 24 words, right? So, you can leave Afghanistan. You have to go through Iran, through Turkey. You have to get on a boat. It's harrowing. Most people don't make it. But you can either memorize 12 words, and before you say, oh, that sounds ridiculous, remember, there's 10 million Muslims who've memorized the entire Quran in the world today. So you can memorize 12 words, trust me, especially if your life depends on it. So, your friend, we won't get into exactly how she did it, but let's just say she could have memorized it. She could have kept it on a USB key. She could have literally emailed the, password to her friend in America. There's a lot of ways you can protect your Bitcoin, but she escaped from this place and was able to put all of her value into this asset. And then eventually she made it to Germany and she was able to start a new life with the Bitcoin. So the existing financial system doesn't permit that sort of thing. It's not possible. And this is a pretty big deal. Now, today, post the fall of Kabul, Bitcoin is allowing you to continue to finance your operations. And to be clear, Roya is responsible for the training and education of thousands of girls and women in Afghanistan. And, it's very difficult to do that if you can't pay them. So today you're using Bitcoin. I know that Bitcoin and stable coins are very important for this. So do you just want to talk about that briefly?
Sure. I mean, after the collapse of the Kabul, which it was very sad to seeing after 20 years of the golden era in Afghanistan, everything's end. So you know that the banking system is collapsed, and then it was very difficult for the families and organization to send aids to Afghanistan. The Western Union didn't work; they were ran out of the cash, and it was very difficult at the time. And one third of the population is starving from not having enough foods, and 70 to 60% of the people didn't had money to pay for their rents. It was very chaos and uncertainty happening. And the only things that during that time was remain safe, it was cryptocurrency. But cryptocurrency, you could send the money, and for the people who get evacuated at the time, for the saving houses, and also for the people who had access to technology and cell phone, you could just simply send the Bitcoin, and they can Bitcoin or stable coins that they can pay for their foods.
You told me something that was a personal thing but I wrote about it in a story that you're featured in. That you tried to convince your parents earlier that year to buy Bitcoin, so that just in case, and you were unsuccessful. So when they fled Afghanistan, they couldn't bring their money with them, and they lost it. And I thought that's a pretty powerful little story. Like, but you were successful in teaching a lot of other people, and when that's the
I
important
couldn't
part.
I couldn't get with my mom because she believes on some things that she can touch and believe on cash, not on kept. And she saw that how the Bitcoin goes up and down, how is it's affected my business and everything. So she didn't want to be that risky. And when she was evacuated, they basically left the country with nothing. They couldn't take their monies from the bank. Didn't take anything. It's not their house, nothing. So everything's get freeze by the camera regime, and my mom lost everything. And I think that that was very sad.
Yeah, and to be fair and balanced, like, we can praise the U.S. government for the investment in women in Afghanistan. Like, that's a massive victory, and that was a great use of our foreign policy. That's what Roya will tell you. But to be fair and balanced, like, freezing the money of the Afghan people was a shameful and embarrassing thing that's led to a lot of people suffering. So it's interesting that, we came in, we did this great thing for women in that country, and then we left, and, people are kind of in the lurch. And one of the ways you can continue doing your work is through Bitcoin. So I feel like a lot of people didn't know that. It's an important story. Thank you for doing what you're doing. I appreciate it.
Thank
Like,
you.
it's very important. Um, uh, Marin, it's an honor for us to have you here. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell the audience a little bit about what you do.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. My name is Meron Estefanos. I'm originally from Eritrea, and I left when I was at 12 to Sweden because my father was an activist. We had to flee the country, so we later joined him, and I've been living in Sweden ever since. Uh, so I did not have any connection to my country since I lived in Eritrea. Eritrea did not even exist at that time. And after independence, later on in life, I went to Eritrea trying to live there and saw that it was a dictatorship. So I came back to Sweden and I became an activist. Uh, and I saw how nobody was writing about Eritrea. Eritrea was not being covered anywhere. So I joined this movement and we started a radio that would broadcast into Eritrea via satellite and shortwave. So I start covering refugee-related issues in my program, which was Voices of Eritrean Refugees, and
And to be
started
clear, how many people today listen to you every week?
inside Eritrea, 500,000 people,
And what's the total population of Eritrea?
about 3.5.
So she's like the Joe Rogan of Eritrea. The serious. Even bigger, actually, by percentage. No, but like 500,000 people are like listening to her. It's amazing. She just does amazing work. So that's just one part of it, though. But then
Yeah.
you also were compelled to try and address the issue of refugees, right?
So covering the refugee issues, which was supposed to be one program, but I ended up getting stuck because I felt so sorry. The refugees that I was talking to were kidnapped in Sudan and sold to the Egyptians as slaves, and families have to buy them out, which costs like minimum ransom is $33,000 a person, up to $70,000 a person, and we are the poorest of the poorest.
And to be clear, like people are fleeing from this regime because it has totally mandatory military service for your entire life, right? As well as no information, no access to outside information, arbitrary arrests anytime this person wants to arrest anybody. It's a totalitarian. I mean, people call it the North Korea of Africa. So people are fleeing just like they flee from Cuba or North Africa, except instead of going on a raft to Miami or fleeing into China, people are fleeing north through the desert or south, like, to try to get to a place like Kenya. But they're going to go north and they're going to try to go to Israel or they're going to try to go to Europe, right? And along the way, they get kidnapped and people like basically, put a gun to their head and they say, call your family who you're going to. And they do the phone call and they say, you need to send me money or we're going to kill this person. And you step in at that point and you try to rescue them, right?
Yeah, at the beginning when I first interviewed these hostages, I just felt like if the world knew about them, this would have stopped right away. And so I start contacting U.S. State Department, European Union, all organizations, those anti-trafficking organizations, but nobody cared. So one by one, the people that I interviewed start dying. In 3 weeks, 5 died of the people that I interviewed, and I just couldn't let them die anymore. And I start raising funds to pay for their ransoms. I don't even know how many millions I've paid.
But you've
Uh,
raised millions of dollars for this.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And before Bitcoin, like how would you get the money to where it needed to go and kind of what were some of your challenges?
That was the hardest part. I had the money to pay for the person to free a person, but sending the money was the most difficult part because Western Union at that time was charging 20 or 25%, and also the limit was $4,500, and MoneyGram was 7,500, I think. And after paying 2 or 3 ransoms for 3 people, MoneyGram called me and said, "You're not welcome to use our services anymore." So the only option became Western Union, and with Western Union it's only $4,500. So
You
I
have to
had
do two chunks or
just
three
yeah,
chunks.
and imagine you're trying to pay $70,000. So I had to
And you have a certain number of hours before the person
yeah,
gets
an
killed.
hour and a half. Often they give you an hour and a half, and they have networks all over the world. I once had I was told to pay in an hour and a half $33,000, and they wanted me to pay the money in Sweden to some people, and so they kept texting. You have an hour left. You have 30 minutes left, and I couldn't get the money in an hour and a half. And an 18-year-old young man was killed because I didn't pay in time, even though we had the money, but it was just impossible. And the traffickers don't think logic, how it's difficult to send money quickly.
They don't care about the
No,
excuse.
they don't.
So you've now started using Bitcoin for this purpose and it's saving lives. There's no exaggeration, right?
Yes. So once Alex Gladstein introduced me to Bitcoin, which I highly appreciate. Thank you for that. And then I just saw how easy it was. It just click, and I said this can actually solve. And now what I do is, if someone is kidnapped, we can get the money in less than half an hour actually, and get it in cash. So it has made my life much easier, and it saves, like, we're not teaching the traffickers to accept them the Bitcoin. We're just teaching someone else, family members, on how they can send them money quickly, and it arrives in Sudan quickly. And then I also teach them on how to convert it into cash and pay on time for their loved
So
ones.
this is just a tool. Bitcoin's a tool like anything else, like the internet, but it makes you a more efficient rescuer is the
Very.
point. And I know I always embarrass you by asking you, but can you give us some insight into how many people you've helped rescue? Total.
It's I don't know, 30, 40,000 at sea, and I don't know how many hostages.
That's it. So you are like a woman of many different talents. So you're educating millions of people. You're rescuing tens of thousands of people. But now you're also building community in East Africa, right? So you're starting a Bitcoin educational center in Uganda. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're opening a
Because this is where a lot of Horn of Africa refugees go, right? They go to Central Africa, they go to Kenya, Uganda, etc., right?
Yeah, so the refugee community, often when they leave their country, they don't leave with ID or anything else, or it's often lost on the way, and they live off remittance. But the problem is they don't know how to receive money. Either they will accept in hawala, but just a few weeks ago, refugees that were supposed to receive money for Easter, the person doing the hawala disappeared with $7 million of Eritrean money. So it keeps happening, this kind of thing. So I felt like the refugees is good to teach them, at least they can accept in Bitcoin, and so thanks to that, so they're teaching their loved ones in the West. Actually, the people in Africa are teaching their loved ones in US and in Europe on how to send Bitcoin, because they prefer to accept it in Bitcoin, where they don't have to show ID or they don't have to open a bank account.
And they don't need, they don't need ID. They don't need a bank account. It's permissionless, and this is a feature. I think we often think about it as a bug because we're sort of trained to think that money that the government doesn't control is bad, is criminal. But for most of the world, money that the government doesn't control is vital because the government's not a good government. Like, again, most people live under an authoritarian regime, not a democracy. So it's very important for us to have money that anybody can access on the internet that the government doesn't control. And we are very privileged to think that money on the internet that the government doesn't control is bad or criminal. That's only something you could possibly conclude if you live in a rich, Western, privileged society. But for most of the people in the world today, you have about 1 billion people who live in a liberal democracy with property rights who have a reserve currency, about 1 billion people. Then everybody else, close to 7 billion lives either in an authoritarian regime or a country with weak currency. So for the vast majority of the world's population, this is a big, big deal, especially for people working with in Fadi's struggle. So Fadi, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, what you do? I think people are very interested to hear.
Thank you, Alex. I have Meron always on speed dial, and I think you should as well.
Speak up.
I said I have. Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Fadi.
Alex. Alex has been my teacher on Bitcoin, but I said I have Meron on speed dial in case you never know. Yeah,
And Roya also, of course.
absolutely. But, my name is Fadi Elsalameen. I always describe that the 3 reasons why somebody like me who grew up in Hebron in the West Bank as a Palestinian would ever use Bitcoin. And the 3 reasons are my grandmother, corruption, and politics. And I'll explain in details. My grandmother lived until about 95 years old. She lived through 5 or 6 different regimes, the Ottoman Empire, the British, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the Palestinian Authority. And she always had this dress on her head that had coins on it. And I always call her the original coin holder in the family. She was the first person to do it. And
These were like made of what? These were
gold,
yeah.
and silver. And whenever they were forced to move, she's never had a bank account ever. And whenever we were forced to move, that was her asset. That was her bank account. That was when she had to pay off somebody, or she wanted to buy a new lot of land or whatever. That's what she needed to use. So I know that if she was alive today, she would be the first person to say, "Where's your Bitcoin? Make sure it's always on you." All right. So that's the first reason. The other reason is corruption, and I think this example applies everywhere. It's not just in Palestine. I started an anti-corruption campaign highlighting the misuse of foreign aid within the Palestinian Authority around 12 years ago, and later on I realized that was not a good idea. It's not. I thought I was doing a great thing. Next thing I noticed was the president is not happy with me. The Palestinian Authority is not happy with me. Apparently, corrupt guys hate it if you try to point out the corruption. I know we're coming to this realization in Washington, D.C. in 2023, but it's a true story. So, a million people later following me on Facebook. A lot of people obviously are surprised to learn about the amount of corruption, but the way it's done, and it's done in a very sophisticated way. Trust me, they could teach PhD courses on how to steal and siphon off foreign aid. And this is really important for USAID and Treasury people who are in the room. And what happened as a result, I woke up one day, my bank account was completely shut down. I'm no longer allowed to have a bank account. But every single piece of information I had ever given to my bank has been taken by the intelligence services who work for the Palestinian president, including a copy of my US passport, my very personal details, and was given to a newspaper that is owned by Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization funded by Iran. And in one day, 4 articles in Al Akhbar newspaper about me, how I am this dangerous guy who's trying to point out corruption, but really have ulterior motives. So all of a sudden, the bank that was supposed to protect my privacy, completely gave out all my information with no legal precedent whatsoever. And I was framed as this terrible guy whose, crime is pointing out corruption. So Alex said, "Hey, I think you're a moron. You should use Bitcoin." He said it in a much nicer way, but and it's true. I was like, "What do you mean Bitcoin?" I don't. What explain it? So we've spent many hours, and it makes complete sense. I don't have to be under the mercy of a corrupt regime. I can send Bitcoin directly. My wire transfers are not intercepted. They're not used against me. And by the way, I'm giving you the very short version of what happened with the bank. The bank asked for a bribe. They were trying to come to me before the freeze happened. They were like, we want to be really nice, but would you pay this amount of money as a bribe? And I say, I'm the guy who's fighting corruption. You want me to get out of this by paying a bribe? No,
You have to pay twice as much, actually.
That's actually was the second. When I said no the first time, they was like, okay, well, the bribe went up. It's actually now, it's not this amount, it's this high amount. So I have a bank account who's frozen right now, but that's actually, I was like forced. And I'm saying I'm not a unique case. This happens in almost every country where there's a repressive regime.
And we forget that the financial system exists to create intermediaries in a way. If you read the Bitcoin white paper, the first paragraph Satoshi talks about how they're trying to make basically digital money for the world without intermediaries. And maybe we think of intermediaries as good guys here. Your local bank, your trustworthy bank, like the regulatory authorities who are gonna FDIC bail you out in case something happens. We have maybe a positive, view of third parties here in the United States. But in most places, third parties are rent-seeking, corrupt, censorious authorities. And that's exactly what you all are dealing with. The number of activists who've had their bank accounts frozen just keeps growing by the day, whether they be human rights activists or environmental activists or labor rights activists. I mean, these people are all going to get targeted. And it's not just that the average Palestinian encounters enormous issues just sending money back home or sending a grant to support something. It's also that, we should just briefly touch on the fact that you don't even have your own currency.
Right.
And we won't go too deep into it, but the point is, during the Oslo Accords process, there was something that people normally don't know about called the Paris Protocol that Arafat signed, which basically gave away Palestinian sovereignty over money as part of the deal. So they have to use the Israeli currency, and they have no control over any sort of they have no control over any sort of monetary freedom. and that must be pretty heavy to have to like use, some other country's money, right? That's a
Right.
little, that's a little rough. So that's another context here is that they've never had their own currency.
It is exactly true. One thing I wanted to point out, if you live in DC, it's easy. You have a bank account, you can go to Wells Fargo, withdraw, you can transfer, it's a totally different game over there. An intelligence officer, if they're corrupt and they really know that you're a thriving business and they want part of your money, they can just walk into the bank and say, show me what he has, then they'll call you up, intimidate you, ask for a bribe. And so the idea of banking privacy laws does not exist, right? So it's hard to compare when you're existing in a society here where there are checks and balances, laws, regulations, etc. In a different world, completely different
Eh,
story.
eh,
On the politics
Yeah.
side, sorry, Alex,
Yeah.
but on the politics side, I completely agree. We had the Oslo Accords, which was signed here in DC, September 13, 1993, at the White House. And 30 years later, Israelis and Palestinians will tell you, "Oh, the peace agreement is dead. There's no two-state solution." They'll give you all the spiel, but what's alive and still alive is the Paris Accords, which is the financial arrangement where um, there's no monetary policy, and it's still like one system. So either the politics follows the money or the money follows the politics, but you can't have those
Yeah, and
two.
then any aid that goes to Palestine has to go through Israel first. And it's interesting because Israel basically takes the forex, they take the Canadian dollars or the US dollars or the euros, and then they print shekels and give them to the PA. So it's an interesting little arrangement they have. We'll just leave it at that.
Right.
So a couple things. We're wrapping up here. We have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to touch on two items here for as takeaways. Uh, the scale of Bitcoin adoption is so staggering. We were in Ghana in December at the Africa Bitcoin Conference organized by Democracy Movement in West Africa because 15 African countries still use a French colonial currency and have no control over their own money. So they're very into Bitcoin because it gives them monetary freedom. And monetary freedom's been a big part of the African democracy movement, actually. One of the main reasons you see democracy movements in West Africa is because people have been living under this French currency that they have no control over. And people organized this event. We all went down there, and it was fascinating to see uh, meeting people from Benin, Cameroon, Malawi, the Congo, Somalia, Somaliland, like places I barely even knew about. There are thriving Bitcoin communities. I met a guy who runs a business in Somalia off remittances. This is one of the main use cases out there. Is people receive Bitcoin or stable coins from their family, and then these companies off ramp it into the local currency in cash. They have tens of thousands of clients in these places. There's circular communities going on. It's just staggering, like the jaw drops. There's a guy from South Africa who invented a way for people to use Bitcoin without the internet by using something called USSD, which is a text message based protocol. So you have a feature phone that has no internet, and you can text a number and a password, and you can have Bitcoin, and you can send it anywhere in the world. This is totally invented over there. We met folks working on renewable mining in Eastern Africa. So they'll go to a place with no electricity. They'll set a little micro hydro into the ground off of a river, and they'll get and without charity, they're making money. They'll electrify a village, and this is happening all across East Africa. It's amazing what you see out there. So just don't underestimate the global scope here. I mean, we're talking, between Bitcoin and stablecoins, we're probably above 500 million people who've used these things. If you start looking at countries like India and Indonesia alone have massive cryptocurrency communities. I mean, we know that one country, El Salvador, has adopted Bitcoin. We know the Central African Republic has adopted it. We know a couple other countries have, but like there are more Indian Bitcoiners alone than the entire amounts of population in these countries. Like, so the scale's really big. Number one. So I don't know if any of you want to comment on that.
There's one example. First of all, it was amazing to be able to buy art directly from the artist using Bitcoin in Ghana. But there's one example I want
You
to
didn't have to
mention.
call your bank ahead of time to tell them you're going to Ghana. No.
No, nothing at all. It was just immediate 10 seconds, and it was unbelievable. There's one example I think that applies to many of the people in the room who are dealing with on the government side. The government of Germany asked some of us who are dealing with Bitcoin to come up with a solution where they are able to pay remittances to Holocaust survivors who are living in Russia, who can no longer receive bank transfers anymore. And they're looking for ways how to use Bitcoin to pay Holocaust survivors who are living there. So the applications are, wide, enormous. It's not just, I know many people in government think, oh, Bitcoin is a way to avoid sanctions. It's actually a way, in this case, it's a way to comply with sanctions and not use banks, because that's the issue, and be able to pay people who need the
Yeah, like
money.
how do you send value to Cuba or Russia without enriching Putin or the Castros with Bitcoin? Like this is, we sit here and we dither and we argue about Cuba policy, and in the meantime, Bitcoin is helping people every day. So I think it's kind of inspiring in that way. So um, don't underestimate the global scope. Don't underestimate the power it has as a human rights tool. And remember, it's tremendously valuable. I mean, anyone who says Bitcoin's a waste of energy doesn't know what they're talking. I mean, they're ignorant. They don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it's a very valuable tool for tens of millions of people worldwide, and that's only going to increase. I mean, the only way you're going to see Bitcoin go away is if governments magically become issuers of sound money that's non-confiscatable and non-censorable and fair for everybody. And that's not going to happen. So, you're just going to see this become more and more and more valuable as we see more devaluation of currency worldwide and more deplatforming. As you see more of those things happen, you're going to see more Bitcoin adoption. The last thing I wanted to end on was energy use, just because I think it's fascinating to think about this. Like people say it's a waste of energy, it uses too much energy. Most people in the world don't have enough energy. This idea that we should reduce our energy use it could only possibly come from a rich advanced country. So I wanted to hear everybody weigh in a little bit on that before we conclude. So just your very quick 30 seconds on what your opinion is that we have to. People in the West are always trying to defend the energy usage of Bitcoin.
I think because they're born in privileged societies and they haven't been in our countries that we don't have electricity most of the time. And I think that you are using electricity for your jet, using for your cruise, you're using for your everything. You have AC, you have using to washing your dresses, but many of our peoples, billions of the people, they don't have this and they don't use it. But Bitcoin is actually helping them. 1.7 billions of the people are unbanked and they don't have any banks, but then they can use the cryptocurrencies as a way to create their own bank. And billions of the people living under authoritarian regime that they are controlling their finance. So
Yeah, just as a reminder, air conditioners in the United States of America use way more energy than all three of their countries combined. In fact, more than the bottom 50 countries. Meron.
Now that I'm living in Africa, I see a lot of people without electricity on a daily basis, even in cities. And I'm looking into mining Bitcoin myself so that I can provide electricity to villages that don't have electricity while doing the mining. So I do not believe this too much energy things. Yes, as Roya said, in the West, yes, a lot of energy is being wasted. But when you are looking at Africa, even cities, like big cities, you will have 6 hours power outage on a daily basis.
I'll do even a reverse example. Look at Ethiopia, a country of over 100 million people. They have the cleanest and cheapest electricity in the world. They're already beginning to produce about 6,000 megawatts out of the Renaissance Dam. There's a lot of excess electricity there.
While people are
Mining,
starving nearby.
yeah, so mining Bitcoin is a no-brainer. It's something that you should, if you really want to help your economy, that's something you can do right there.
Yeah, and it's Bitcoin mining is all about what kind of energy is it using, and you know what? It happens to be a consumer, a user of energy that happens to be using a lot of renewable energy, and that's going to increase. So we think it's going to be really interesting to see the impact it has on many countries around the world that don't currently have the ability to harness these vast amounts of solar, geothermal, wind, resources, and Bitcoin mining is going to help unlock that. So that's quite cool. So just as a closing thought, when you think about America and American values and American foreign policy, we think about things like democracy, freedom, human rights. Oftentimes our foreign policy has sort of failed to achieve that. Sometimes it's succeeded. But regardless, we think you should view Bitcoin as an ally here. I mean, it gives individuals property rights and free speech, and it helps push power back. It helps them kind of take a little power back from their governments. So it's a very, very American thing. So, we think that it's going to be a very valuable tool in American foreign policy moving forward, and especially in democracy promotion. So thank you all very much for having us, and thanks to the organizers for giving my friends a voice. Thank you.